That night the heavens didn't open. They ruptured, spilling their grief over Lagos until even the streetlights bowed beneath the weight. Thunder rolled like a verdict passed in a language only the lost could understand, and lightning cut the sky into pieces bright enough to expose my shame. For one heartbeat, the world stood still, as though God himself was searching for my face in the flood. By dawn, the storm would have washed away the last trace of the woman I once was. I huddled beneath the flyover with my daughter pressed to my chest, the smell of diesel and wet dust filling our lungs, the cardboard beneath us melting into pulp. Each drop that struck my skin felt like an accusation. Angel slept fitfully, her breath shallow, her small hand clinging to my wrapper as if she could anchor us both to the world. I whispered lies that sounded like lullabies. Thunder was angels clapping. Rain was heaven watering the earth. But the lies trembled on my tongue, thin as the plastic sheet above our heads. When the lightning came again, it illuminated a billboard promising light for every home. I laughed without sound. My home was the space between the concrete pillars, my walls made of shadows, my ceiling the mercy of weather. The city above roared with engines and perfume. We below existed in the runoff of other people's lives. I once wore a white nurse's uniform, crisp and proud, but pride dissolves faster than cardboard when it's soaked long enough. The rain thickened until the world blurred. That was when I saw him. A black car, stranded mid-street, its hazard lights blinking like a failing heartbeat. A man bent over the bonnet, water streaming from his hair, frustration tightening every line of his body. Even soaked, he carried the posture of someone who expected to be obeyed. He looked out of place in the storm, as if wealth itself had taken a wrong turn. I should have looked away. Pity for strangers is a luxury hunger cannot afford. But then Angel stirred, her eyes half open, and whispered, "Mama, help him." Her voice cut through the thunder-like command. I rose. The cold bit into my legs as I stepped into the flood. The water climbed past my ankles, thick with mud and memory. Each step toward him felt like walking back into the world I'd been cast out of. When he noticed me, his expression flickered between alarm and disbelief. "Madam, go back," he shouted over the wind. "You'll catch your death." "Maybe," I said, "but your car will die first." For a heartbeat he hesitated, then stepped aside. I tore the scarf from my head and wedged it across the vent the way my late husband had once shown me. The motion was muscle memory. The pain it stirred was not. The man turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared alive, a sound so sudden and strong it startled both of us into silence. He exhaled, half a laugh, half a prayer. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "Neither should you," I answered, though my teeth were chattering too hard to sound brave. He studied me, then slipped off his jacket and placed it over my shoulders. The warmth of it shocked me more than the gesture. It smelled of rain and cologne, and a world I used to know. Before I could speak, he was already in the car, headlights cutting through the water. I turned to carry the borrowed warmth back to my child, but lightning split the sky again and froze the street in white fire. Far down the road his car stood still once more, its brake lights glowing through the rain like two eyes unwilling to look away. Then darkness folded over the city, swallowing the color, the man, and every certainty I had left. The thunder that followed whispered my name as if testing how it sounded. I pressed his jacket to my heart, my daughter's breath small against me, and understood that the storm had only just begun. Not every man stranded in a storm is lost. Some are simply waiting to see who will walk toward them. The rain blurred the world into silver and shadow, yet when his eyes found mine, they were sharp enough to cut through the downpour. He looked at me as if I had stepped out of a memory he didn't know he possessed. That night, beneath the bridge of thunder, I discovered that even strangers can carry pieces of your past. The wind howled between the pillars, whipping my soaked wrapper against my legs as I reached him. The car's engine hissed like a wounded animal, steam rising in white ribbons that smelled of metal and fear. He stood over it, helpless in a way that didn't fit his posture, hands gripping the edge of the bonnet as though control were something he could still hold on to. For a heartbeat, we only stared, two lives from opposite worlds colliding in the same breath of rain. Then I heard my own voice break the silence. "Please," I said, "let me help." He blinked, surprised that a voice like mine could speak to him at all. "Do you know what you're doing?" he asked, the words careful, polite, and edged with disbelief. "Not really," I replied, "but trying never killed anyone." Something flickered behind his guarded expression. Maybe humor, maybe the recognition that I was no beggar asking for coins, but a woman daring to be useful. I tore the scarf from my head, twisted it between my hands until water streamed away, then wedged it across the vent to block the flood. My fingers shook, not from fear, but from the shock of remembering. My husband's hands guiding mine years ago, his laughter mingling with thunder from another season. The memory ached like an old wound reopening under cold water. He watched me work, rain running down his face, his eyes following every movement as if studying a language he had forgotten. When the scarf settled into place, I nodded toward the driver's seat. "Try now." The key turned. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared back to life, a deep metallic sound that felt like victory. The relief that spread across his face was so human that for a moment I forgot who we were, just two souls grateful for the same sound of survival. He laughed quietly, disbelief softening his features. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, voice low enough that it was almost lost to the storm. "Neither should you," I answered, and he smiled. A real one this time, small and strange, like light breaking through heavy clouds. He slipped off his jacket and placed it over my shoulders without asking. The warmth startled me. The fabric carried the faint scent of cedar and something sharper, a smell that spoke of offices, power, and dry places where the rain never dared to reach. I wanted to thank him, but the words drowned in my throat. Gratitude, after all, can feel heavier than water. He studied me as though weighing a decision, then asked, "What's your name?" "Adeobi," I said. He repeated it quietly, tasting the syllables like a secret. "Tunde." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The storm raged around us, but the space between us was strangely still, charged with something I couldn't name. I could feel the pulse of the city beyond the rain, sirens in the distance, the hum of power lines. But in that narrow slice of time, it felt as if the world had folded to make room for only us. When the engine steadied and his headlights flared, he looked at me again, and in that brief, impossible second, I saw recognition, real and raw, as though he already knew my story. Then he blinked, and the expression vanished, replaced by the practiced calm of men who own too much of the world to show surprise. He climbed into the car, the door closing with a sound that felt final, yet I couldn't move. The rain pressed harder, and I was left standing in the halo of his taillights, the jacket clinging to my skin, wondering how a man like him could look at me, as if remembering a promise he never made. I didn't know it yet, but the stranger who didn't belong to the rain would soon decide where my life went when the storm cleared. Before that night, I wasn't invisible. I was erased. Once they called me Madam Adeobi, the nurse whose smile soothed pain and made patients believe recovery was possible. Then, the day my husband's body came home wrapped in plastic instead of pay, the world shifted its gaze. I learned that when the city loses interest in you, it forgets your name faster than the rain dries. The weeks after his death blurred together, one long season of loss. I watched the hospital where I'd once healed others send me away with a warning about budget cuts. The bills that came after the funeral grew taller than the headstone I couldn't afford. Friends who had eaten at our table stopped answering calls. Even the church pew that used to feel like refuge began to feel like judgment. Debt collectors became our only visitors, and their knocks sounded like thunder rehearsing for the storm that would later claim me. The day the landlord came with 2 men and a folded notice, I begged for time. He didn't look at me, just pointed to the door and said the rent was overdue by too many prayers. I packed our lives into 2 plastic bags, clothes, an old photo, my nursing license I couldn't bear to throw away. That night, my daughter and I slept under the open sky for the first time. She called the stars her nightlights. I called my hunger a fast, so she would believe we were holy, not homeless. Lagos moved around us, relentless and shining, its heartbeats the horns of Danfoss and the laughter of people who still belonged somewhere. I tried to belong too. I stood at clinic gates asking for work, at churches asking for miracles, at shops asking for kindness. Every time someone shook their head, I felt a little more of my name slip away. Adaobi, the nurse, became Ada, the woman by the bridge. Then even that shortened version faded until I was only, "Hey you," or worse, silence. Still, I believed in mercy. My mother used to say that God walks slowly but never passes you by. I waited for his footsteps in every sunrise. Some mornings when Angel slept curled against me, I whispered promises into her hair, promises I didn't know how to keep, that I would find a roof, that her father's ghost would not have to watch her grow up in rain. And yet, faith has a way of cracking beneath constant water. By the time the storm returned, I had stopped praying and started listening instead, just in case heaven whispered something useful. When the stranger appeared again, it was as if the rain had taken pity on me. He came walking through the market street with an umbrella, large enough to make its own sky. The collar of his coat was turned up, his shoes splashed with mud, and yet he looked at me the same way he had the night before, like someone seeing a miracle where the world saw a mistake. He didn't speak at first. He simply held the umbrella over Angel and me, letting the water strike his shoulders instead. I couldn't find my voice. Mercy, when it finally arrives, never looks the way you imagined. He said my name quietly, Adaobi, as if testing whether it still fit me. I wanted to ask how he remembered it, why he cared, but all I could manage was a whisper of thanks. His hand trembled slightly as he offered me a folded card, his business name, embossed, powerful, and told me to meet him the next morning at a place I had no courage to enter. "It's just lunch," he said. "Nothing more." But the way he said it made it sound like the beginning of something that might rewrite the rules. I didn't know whether to trust him or the silence between his words. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but its echo lingered in my pulse. I kept turning the card over in my hands, wondering if Mercy had truly found me, or if it was just wearing another disguise. As dawn crept over the city, the letters of his name caught the light, and I realized Mercy never walks alone. It always brings a test, and mine was waiting at sunrise. Hunger makes you dream of food, but kindness, real, unexpected kindness, teaches you how to breathe again. That morning, the stranger returned, carrying a parcel that steamed in the cold air, its smell curling through the damp like a memory made visible. Inside were jollof rice, fried plantain, and a goosey soup, rich enough to make the air taste of home. For a moment I forgot the ache in my stomach and remembered what it felt like to be seen. He set the parcel beside me beneath the bridge, rain still dripping from the edges of the concrete above. Angel sat up quickly, her thin fingers hovering as if afraid the food might vanish if she touched it too soon. The man smiled, small, tired, honest, and said, "Eat. It's nothing. Nothing." To us it was everything. Color, scent, life condensed into a single offering. I spooned the rice slowly, each bite a reminder that survival could still taste beautiful. Angel giggled through a mouthful of plantain. The sound was the first laughter I had heard from her since before her father died. He watched us in silence, one hand resting on the umbrella handle, the other clenched around something in his pocket. When our plates were half empty, he asked quietly, "Why did you help me that night?" The question sounded less like curiosity and more like confession. I swallowed, wiped my hands on my wrapper, and said, "Because everyone deserves warmth, even in the rain." He looked away, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. "You reminded me of who I used to be," he said, and there was something fragile in his voice. Guilt, maybe, or longing. Then he unfolded a piece of paper from his pocket, pressed it into my hand, and stood. "Take this," he said. "No one should live where mercy cannot find them." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked toward the main road, the umbrella a dark wing against the light drizzle. When he was gone, I looked at the paper. It was folded neatly, heavier than it should have been, the edges still warm from his hand. Angel asked, "Mama, is he an angel?" I wanted to laugh, but the truth sat too close to the surface. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe the kind that wears wet shoes." She giggled again and went back to eating. I slipped the paper into my wrapper and let the moment settle around us like warmth after fever. The rest of the day passed in a strange hush. People hurried past as usual, buses coughed and sputtered, the market above hummed with voices, but none of it touched me. All I could think about was that folded note and the man's eyes when he said I had reminded him of himself. Who had he been before the world turned him into someone who could own half a city? What part of me had mirrored that man enough to make him remember? The questions followed me like shadows, but for the first time they didn't frighten me. They pulled me forward. As evening bled into night, the rain returned, softer now, a lullaby instead of a warning. I held Angel close, the smell of rice still clinging to her hair, the paper heavy against my skin. The bridge no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a waiting room. Somewhere beyond the rain, a door had opened, and I could feel its draft even from here. When I finally unfolded the note, I didn't find money or promises, just an address written in careful ink and the words, "Come tomorrow." The rain struck the page, blurring the letters into something that looked almost holy. I pressed it to my heart, trembling with fear that hope might be another kind of trap. By dawn, I knew I would go, because mercy never knocks twice. It opens the door and waits to see if you'll step through. The poor aren't afraid of ghosts. We're afraid of gates that never open. The morning I found myself standing before the tallest one in Lagos, the paper in my hand had gone limp with sweat and disbelief. The iron shimmered like something alive, black and endless, guarding a world I had only seen through the tinted glass of other people's cars. Somewhere beyond it waited the man the rain had delivered back into my life. The guard's eyes scanned the paper, then lifted it to my face with something like curiosity. "Madam Adeobi?" he asked, and before I could gather an answer, the gate sighed open. The sound was softer than thunder, yet heavier than any sermon I'd ever heard. I stepped forward, each stride swallowing another heartbeat of fear, until the ground changed beneath me. Mud giving way to marble, puddles replaced by mirrors of stone. The mansion rose ahead, pale and impossible, its windows reflecting a sky too blue to remember the storm that had brought me here. Inside, the air smelled of polish and silence. My footsteps felt like trespass. Chandeliers hung above me like frozen lightning, their crystals catching the light the way raindrops once caught fire. I wanted to turn back, but the memory of my daughter's laughter, fed and warm for the first time in months, kept me moving. A maid led me through a corridor lined with art I couldn't name, past doors that whispered wealth. When we stopped, she gestured toward an open room. Mr. Tunde sat behind a long glass table, sleeves rolled, expression unreadable. The same man who had looked lost in the rain now looked carved from calm. "You helped me," he said simply. "Now let me help you." His voice was polite, smooth, but underneath it I heard something else, the echo of command, the habit of being obeyed. I wanted to run. Nothing free in Lagos comes without a cost. My voice trembled as I answered, "I don't want charity." He smiled, and the smile was patient, almost kind. "Good," he said. I'm not offering any. He gestured toward the table where bread, fruit, and tea waited, steam curling like ghosted breath. I sat because refusing would have been another kind of hunger. He poured tea for me with careful hands, as if the act itself required ceremony. "Tell me," he said, "what do you want most?" The question stunned me. Want was a luxury I had forgotten. I wanted roofs, safety, sleep, but those were survival, not desire. I looked down at my calloused fingers and whispered, "To feel useful again." Something in his expression softened. "Then maybe we can help each other," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "I run a foundation. We sponsor clinics, schools, and shelters. I need someone who knows what it means to build trust from nothing. You know." He paused. "Would you work for me?" I stared at him, unable to speak. The rain outside the tall windows had begun again, faint and steady, like a heartbeat tapping on glass. Part of me wanted to believe this was mercy, answering all the prayers I'd stopped saying. Another part whispered that no man gives without reason. I thought of Angel waiting under the bridge, of the cardboard home that leaked when the sky wept, and nodded slowly. "Yes," I said, though the word tasted like surrender. Cliffhanger. 3-4 lines. His smile deepened, but his eyes darkened with something colder than gratitude. He leaned forward, the distance between us closing until I could smell the faint trace of rain still clinging to him. "Before you accept," he said softly, "there's a test." The air seemed to pause around his words, heavy with the promise of danger disguised as opportunity. One that could either save or destroy your life. 6. The test. 700 words model. Hook. 3-4 lines. Sometimes the richest gifts wear the mask of work. When Mr. Tunde said he had a test for me, I imagined cruelty wrapped in kindness, a trick the powerful play to remind the poor of their place. Instead, he handed me a ledger, a truck key, and a promise that smelled of possibility. "Distribute food to those who need it most," he said. "Do it with honesty, and you'll find yourself again." For a long moment, I only stared at him. The words trust and me had not shared a sentence in years. Yet there he was, placing faith in hands the world had learned to ignore. The first morning I climbed into the truck, the seat still smelled of new leather and second chances. Angel sat beside me, clutching a stack of flyers, her face bright with pride. "We're helping people, Mama," she said. And the sound of those words was worth more than any wage. The streets of Lagos looked different from behind a windshield instead of beneath it. Markets bloomed on every corner, color, noise, heat, and as I handed out boxes of food, eyes followed us with a mixture of suspicion and gratitude. Some took the parcels with shaking hands, murmuring blessings. Others turned away, ashamed to be seen accepting help from someone they once passed without seeing. Kindness, I learned, can feel heavier than hunger. Every evening, I returned the truck to the small warehouse Tunde had given me access to, logging each delivery with the careful precision of my old hospital days. My daughter drew hearts in the margins of the ledger, calling them signatures of love. She liked to believe that each box we delivered was a prayer answered. Slowly, the neighborhood began to know us as the kind ones, the woman and child who came with food and smiles, even when the rain fell. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt a pulse of purpose beneath my ribs. Yet gratitude carries its own kind of noise. Whispers followed us, questions about where the food came from, why a man like Tunde would send a woman like me into the streets with his name printed on the flyers. I ignored them at first, telling myself that gossip was just hunger looking for a story. But sometimes, when I caught my reflection in the truck window, I saw the doubt there too. Was this truly mercy, or was I being measured for something I couldn't yet see? One afternoon, as I carried supplies into the truck, I noticed a figure watching from across the street. A man with a scar on his jaw, his face half hidden under a cap. He looked away when I met his gaze, but the unease lingered. That night I mentioned it to Tunde. He listened without interrupting, then said, Every good thing attracts shadows. Focus on the light." His words were gentle, but his eyes were distant, as if he already knew more than he was saying. Days bled into weeks. The routine became a rhythm I trusted. Load, deliver, record, return. The warehouse smelled of flour and diesel. The rain outside began to sound like applause instead of warning. Angel's laughter filled the cab, and for the first time, I believed that maybe God had remembered us. I even dared to dream of saving enough money to rent a small room, to buy a bed that didn't have to be folded away when morning came. But mercy, I have learned, never travels alone. It brings its own tests, wrapped in comfort. That evening, as I locked the truck and wiped the rain from my face, a voice cut through the quiet. It was low, familiar, and sharp enough to slice through years of distance. "Adaobi," it said, the name spoken with ownership, not affection. My hands froze on the lock as the air around me thickened. I turned slowly toward the sound, heart pounding, already knowing whose voice had found me again. The one from a past I had buried beneath the flood. You can escape hunger, but never history. It waits behind closed doors and dark corners, patient as rot. The afternoon I heard my name spoken in that old mocking tone. The years collapsed like paper in rain. I turned, and there he was, my former landlord, the man who had once dragged my life onto the street and called it business. He leaned against the wall near the warehouse, arms folded, eyes glinting with cruel delight. "So," he said, "you found yourself a new man to feed you?" His laughter sliced through the air sharper than the rusted lock in my hand. I wanted to answer, but anger and shame tangled in my throat, until silence became my only defense. I turned away, yet his voice followed, throwing words like stones, each one aimed at the fragile respect I'd rebuilt. By evening, his poison had already begun to spread. The next day at the market, I felt it in the glances. Women who once smiled now whispered behind baskets of peppers. Men who had begged for food parcels avoided my eyes. The story had grown wings. The homeless widow rescued by a rich benefactor, the widow who repaid kindness with something less holy. The gossip was almost beautiful in its precision. It took pieces of truth and shaped them into a lie that fit neatly inside people's hunger for scandal. I kept working. The truck still rolled through the streets, Angel's laughter still filled the cab, but inside I felt the old fear returning, the fear of being nothing more than rumor. At night I washed the dirt from my hands and whispered to myself that dignity is not granted. It's rebuilt brick by stubborn brick. Yet every whisper felt weaker than the one before. Mr. Tund said nothing. If he had heard the rumors, his face gave no sign. His calm was both comfort and mystery. He met me each morning with the same quiet nod, the same question about deliveries, the same measured kindness that neither encouraged nor dismissed the lies. Sometimes I thought his silence protected me. Other times I feared it meant agreement. Still, the work went on. Weeks passed, and the whispers dulled into background noise. People cared more about full plates than empty gossip. But inside me, unease grew roots. Why did he, a man with the wealth to buy obedience, continue to trust a woman the world called tainted? One evening, as we sorted the week's accounts, I asked, half joking, "Sir, do you ever regret giving me that job?" He looked up from his papers, the faintest smile touching his mouth. "Regret," he said softly. "Regret is for people who forget why they began." Then he closed the ledger and walked out, leaving the air heavy with meanings I couldn't name. I tried to forget the question his words planted, but the seed grew quietly. Every gesture of his, the way his eyes softened when Angel ran to greet him, the way he lingered before saying goodbye, felt threaded with something I couldn't explain. One night, long after everyone had gone, I stayed behind to finish the inventory. The mansion was hushed, its marble floors gleaming like moonlit water. His office door stood ajar, light spilling in a golden line across the hall. I hesitated. then stepped inside to return a forgotten ledger. The room smelled of cedar and rain. Files lay stacked neatly, his chair pushed back as though he had just risen. On the desk, beside a glass of unfinished tea, sat a small framed photograph. I reached for it without thinking. My fingers trembled as I lifted it into the light. The face that stared back was one I had sworn I'd never see again. Broad smile, calloused hands, the dust of construction, clinging to his clothes. My husband, the man the city had buried under broken steel and unpaid wages. Standing beside him in the photo was a younger Mr. Tunde, arm around his shoulder, smiling the same smile he now hid behind courtesy and silence. The frame slipped from my grasp, striking the desk with a dull thud that shattered the room's stillness. My pulse thundered louder than the rain outside. In that single frozen moment, I understood that my past and my present were bound by a truth I was never meant to uncover. I turned toward the doorway, heart stammering, already sensing his shadow there, waiting to ask how much I had seen. Fate doesn't bring strangers together. It reconnects unfinished stories. That night, staring at the photograph on Tunde's desk, I felt the floor tilt beneath me. My husband, bright-eyed and alive, stood beside Tunde, both of them in construction helmets, smiling as if the world had already promised them tomorrow. My breath caught in my throat. The storm outside could not drown the sound of memory roaring back to life. Sleep refused to visit me. Every blink brought back that image. My husband's hand resting on Tunde's shoulder, two men bound by something I didn't yet understand. At dawn, when the rain softened into mist, I walked to the mansion again, my steps heavier than truth. He was in his office, eyes shadowed, his usual calm cracked by exhaustion. The photograph lay face down on the table, as though he already knew I had seen it. "How did you know him?" I asked. My voice sounded foreign, scraped raw by disbelief. Tunde looked up slowly. The faint tremor in his hands betrayed more emotion than his face would ever show. "He saved my life once," he said. "Your husband." I waited for more, heart pounding, until the silence between us became unbearable. "How?" I whispered. He leaned back, eyes distant. "Years ago, when I was still learning to build what I now own, I inspected a site your husband worked on. A beam came loose above me. He pushed me out of the way, took the fall himself. By the time they pulled him out, he was gone." His voice cracked, a small human sound that didn't belong to the man the city called untouchable. "I owed him my life. I never repaid it. When I saw you that night in the rain." He paused, shaking his head. "It wasn't charity. It was the only way I could breathe again." The truth struck me like thunder. I had helped the man my husband once saved. The circle of fate had closed with cruel perfection. Tears blurred my vision, spilling hot and silent down my cheeks. I wanted to speak, to say something that could ease the weight in both our hearts, but grief makes words heavy. I could only nod, my hands gripping the chair until my knuckles ached. Tunde stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city glimmered under a pale sun, all glass and motion, unaware of the ghosts standing in its reflection. "I couldn't help him when he died," he said softly. "But I can help you live. That's all I've wanted since the night the storm brought you back." Something inside me cracked then. Not from pain, but from the release of carrying too much alone. I told him about the years after my husband's death, about the eviction, the hunger, the nights spent counting thunderclaps so Angel would think it was a game. He listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, his silence the kind that understood without demanding. When I finished, the air between us felt less like distance and more like absolution. He moved to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out a folder. "I was going to show you this after the next audit," he said, "but perhaps this is the right time." Inside were documents, schematics, permits, and photographs of unfinished projects. "Your husband's company was one of the smaller contractors we absorbed," he explained. "After the accident, his partners disappeared. taking the insurance money. I've spent years trying to trace what they owed his family. The words sank slowly, heavier than gratitude, sweeter than revenge. For the first time in years, I felt justice breathing somewhere close enough to touch. I wanted to thank him, to tell him that his kindness had rewritten the memory of every cruel night I'd endured. But before I could speak, his phone buzzed sharply on the desk. His eyes flicked to the screen, and all the color drained from his face. The light from the phone reflected in his pupils like fire. "What is it?" I asked, but he didn't answer, only turned the device toward me. On the screen, a news alert scrolled across in bold letters. A hostile takeover underway. Tunda Holdings under siege. In that instant, I realized the storm had never left. It had simply changed its shape. Power hides best in plain sight, especially behind humility. The morning the headlines screamed, "Tunda Holdings under attack," the truth unfolded like lightning across a dark sky. That was the moment I finally understood who he truly was. Not just a businessman, but the man who owned half the city, that had once spat me out. He had built empires from concrete and silence, and yet he'd walked into the rain as if he had nothing to lose. I sat in the small office beside him, the newspaper trembling in my hands. The articles spoke in numbers I couldn't even imagine. Millions, contracts, offshore accounts, all bound to his name. I remembered the night under the bridge, the man stranded beside his car, his voice low and uncertain. The same man who now held the fate of thousands in his palm. It didn't make sense. Kindness and power rarely shared the same face. When he entered the room, his composure was as sharp as ever, but his eyes told another story. Edges of sleeplessness, a flicker of pain behind control. He took the newspaper from my hands and set it aside, as though headlines were only background noise. "You didn't tell me who you were," I whispered. My voice trembled with disbelief more than accusation. He looked up, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "Would you have helped me if I did?" I didn't answer because both of us already knew the truth. That night in the storm, I hadn't seen power. I had seen a man in need. Maybe that was why he trusted me now, because I was the only person who'd met him without knowing how much he was worth. He moved toward the window. His reflection doubled against the glass, a ghost of strength divided by worry. "They've been plotting this for months," he said quietly. "The board, the investors, even people I once called friends. They want everything. My name, my legacy." His tone was calm, but I heard the fatigue underneath, the kind that doesn't come from work, but from betrayal. For a moment, I could see the weight he carried, the endless meetings, the silent wars, the cost of pretending to be untouchable. "Money makes enemies faster than love makes friends," he said, half to himself. I wanted to comfort him, but what words could I offer a man surrounded by wealth and loneliness in equal measure? The phone on his desk buzzed. He ignored it. Outside, the city stretched in glass and steel, a monument he had built and now had to defend. I realized then that I had only ever seen power from below, as something distant and unreachable. Standing beside him, I saw its price. Power wasn't freedom. It was a cage made of expectations too heavy for one heart to hold. He turned suddenly, eyes focused on me, as if remembering something urgent. "You once told me everyone deserves warmth," he said. "Do you still believe that?" "Yes," I said, the answer immediately. "Even those who have everything." He nodded, almost relieved. "Then help me keep mine." The simplicity of the request stunned me. I wasn't a lawyer or a banker. I was just a woman who had once prayed for shelter. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the exhaustion tracing lines across his face. "You know people I can't reach," he said. "The markets, the clinics, the streets. They trust you in ways they never trusted me. If I lose everything, they'll suffer too. I need you to make them believe in me again." The enormity of it settled on my shoulders like a new kind of storm. The city that had forgotten my name now whispered in fear and speculation, and somehow I was being asked to stand between him and the flood. I didn't know whether to feel honored or terrified, but deep inside, I knew I would help him. Maybe because mercy, once received, becomes impossible to withhold. He looked at me then, all pretense stripped away, and for the first time I saw not the tycoon or the savior, but a man on the edge of losing everything. "Adaobi," he said, his voice steady despite the storm in it. "I need your help again." The air between us tightened, heavy with trust and danger in equal measure. Somewhere outside, thunder rumbled, not from the sky this time, but from the city rising to challenge its own king. The same city that ignores your hunger will devour your success. I had thought storms only came from the sky, but this one came dressed in fine suits and forged signatures. Tunde's enemies had found their weapon. Fake charity records, the very program I managed. If they succeeded, the scandal would not only ruin him, it would drown me too. When he told me what they'd done, the room felt smaller, the air heavier. "They've planted false invoices," he said, pushing a file across his desk. "Funds that never existed, all under your signature." I stared at the papers, my hands trembling, the ink already blurring in my vision. "We'll fight them," I whispered, though my voice carried more faith than certainty. He met my eyes and nodded once. Together. The following days bled into one another. Endless hours sorting receipts, calling suppliers, visiting orphanages and clinics to gather statements that proved every grain of rice, every loaf of bread, had reached those it was meant for. We traced every path of money, every distribution route, every record I had kept in my ledger with stubborn precision. Still, doubt began to ripple through the city. Newspapers questioned our motives, the same mouths that once called us the kind ones, now hinting at corruption and deceit. I had thought gossip was cruel when I was poor. I hadn't known it could turn lethal when aimed upward. Angel tried to comfort me in her small way, bringing tea I couldn't drink, drawing pictures of sunny skies that felt too bright for the world we were trapped in. At night, I sat by her bed, staring at the folder of evidence, terrified that one missing receipt could erase everything I had rebuilt. I prayed for calm, but the city's noise pressed against the windows. Engines, sirens, the restless hum of people who would rather believe scandal than sincerity. The night before the court hearing, I woke to the sound of breaking glass. The rain outside was relentless, drumming against the roof like 1,000 impatient hands. Angel screamed from the next room. I ran barefoot through the house, the cold tile biting my feet, just in time to see a shadow darting toward the back door, papers clutched under one arm. My ledger. Our proof. I grabbed a lantern and ran after him into the rain. The streets were slick and empty, the storm washing away every sound but thunder. The figure ahead moved quickly, confident, his silhouette sharp against the streetlights. Something in the way he ran tugged at my memory, an arrogance in his stride that felt painfully familiar. When he stumbled at the corner and turned, lightning carved his face out of the dark. My former landlord. The same man who had thrown me and my daughter into the streets, whose lies had once spread like oil through my life. I shouted his name, but he only laughed, sprinting through the puddles, splashing filth across the street like a signature of his cruelty. I caught up to him near the market stalls, grabbing his sleeve. The papers spilled between us, pages fluttering like frightened birds. He turned, his grin wicked under the dim streetlight. "You think Tunde saved you?" he said, voice dripping with mockery. "You don't know what he's hiding." The rain drowned his words after that, but his laughter stayed, echoing off the walls long after he vanished into the dark. I dropped to my knees, gathering the soaked papers, ink bleeding into illegibility, my heart pounding with fear that he was telling the truth, that behind Tunde's mercy, there was another secret waiting to shatter me. As I pressed the ruined papers to my chest, lightning flashed again, revealing the empty street where he'd stood moments ago. The storm had swallowed him, but his words lingered, poisoning the air. You don't know what he's hiding. I looked toward the mansion glowing faintly on the hill, and felt a new kind of terror take root, not of losing everything, but of discovering what I had helped protect. Some storms don't come to drown you. They come to strip away every disguise until only the truth remains. The next morning, I walked into Tunde's office with the weight of the night still clinging to me like wet clothes. I didn't knock. The photo of my husband, the landlord's laughter, his words, they all chased me into that room. What did he mean? I asked, my voice trembling more from fear than anger. He didn't look surprised. The weariness in his eyes told me he'd been waiting for this confrontation. He's right, he said quietly, his hands folded on the desk as if bracing himself for impact. I built my empire on land your husband died working on. The sentence fell between us like thunder. For a moment the air refused to move. I stared at him, unable to blink, unable to breathe. So all this, I whispered, my throat burning. The food, the job, the house, was guilt. No, he said quickly, shaking his head. It started as guilt, but it became something else, gratitude. You reminded me I still had a soul. His voice cracked, the calm breaking at last. I saw the man behind the empire, exhausted, haunted, human. My fury twisted with heartbreak, creating something neither of us could name. Do you know what it's like, I said, to hold your child while the city that killed your husband walks past without looking? Do you know how many nights I asked God why the sky spared you and not him? Tunde stood, his expression shattered, and for the first time, he looked small inside the vastness of his own power. Every day, he said, every time I build something new, I see his face in the foundation. I told myself that if I could build enough, I could bury the guilt under the concrete. But guilt is a kind of rain. It seeps through everything. The silence that followed was unbearable. Outside, the clouds gathered again, heavy and gray, as though the heavens themselves were listening. He turned away from me, opened a drawer, and took out a thick envelope. When he handed it to me, his fingers trembled slightly. Half of my estate, he said, voice low, for you and your daughter. It's time I repay what I owe. I stared at the papers, the legal stamps, the signatures, the clean ink spelling my name in a world I had never belonged to. The weight of it terrified me. I don't want your pity, I whispered. He shook his head. It's not a pity. It's balanced. I've spent years buying forgiveness from strangers, but I've never earned it. Maybe this is the first honest thing I've ever done. I didn't know whether to accept or run. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Gratitude and anger wrestled inside me, both demanding to be heard. Behind him, rain began to trace long, slow lines down the glass, turning the city outside into a blur of movement and memory. For a fleeting second, I saw the reflection of my husband standing beside Tunde's. Two men whose choices had written both our fates. And somewhere between the thunder and the quiet, I felt the first fragile stir of forgiveness, not for him, but for myself, for surviving. He looked at me then, eyes wet, voice soft. Whatever you decide, Adaobi, just know this. You saved me long before I tried to save you. I wanted to answer, to say something that could bridge the unspoken years between our pain, but the words refused to come. All that filled the room was the rhythm of the rain, steady and merciless, as if reminding us that truth, once freed, never stops falling. Before I could speak, his phone rang, a sharp, sudden sound that cut through the storm. He glanced at the screen, and the color drained from his face. "What is it?" I asked, but he didn't reply. The phone slipped from his hand, landing with a dull thud on the desk. I picked it up and saw only one word flashing across the screen: accident. And in that instant, I knew the storm wasn't finished with us yet. Some goodbyes come dressed as thunder, loud, sudden, unforgettable. One moment, Tunde was standing before me, phone pressed to his ear. The next, his body crumpled as though the storm outside had reached into the room and claimed him. The doctors said it was his heart, but I knew it was the weight of guilt and grace colliding at last. Mercy had saved him, but it had also cost him everything. I stayed by his side in the hospital, the monitors whispering his heartbeat in uneven rhythms. Every breath he took felt borrowed from a heaven that wasn't ready for him yet. I whispered prayers between tears, prayers I hadn't known since the night my husband died. Not for a miracle this time, but for peace. When his eyes fluttered open, he smiled weakly. "You were never a beggar, Adaobi," he said, his voice barely more than wind. "You were my reminder." Then the machine gave a single flat sound that silenced the world. The days after blurred into gray. Lagos mourned him like a king. Banners lined the streets. Headlines called him a visionary lost too soon, and people who had never met him wept on camera. I stood among them, invisible once more, holding my daughter's hand while the rain fell steady and soft. The world mourned the empire he built. I mourned the man who had finally remembered what it meant to be human. Weeks passed. The mansion behind the gates became a shrine of flowers and silence. Lawyers arrived, voices polished and cold, reading wills and dividing estates. I refused to touch the papers he had signed for me until the storm inside me quieted. I didn't want his wealth. I wanted the truth to mean something. So I went back to where it all began. Beneath the bridge, the city's forgotten heart, still beating between concrete and water. The first day I returned, the sky greeted me with drizzle, as if recognizing its own reflection. The place hadn't changed. The same flickering lights, the same smell of smoke and damp cardboard. But this time, I wasn't the woman hiding from the rain. I was the one holding boxes of food, giving warmth where the world offered none. The others looked at me with curiosity at first, then gratitude. Angel handed out small loaves, her laughter rising above the rumble of thunder, and for the first time, I realized she had grown without fear. Every week we came back, rain or shine. The bridge that once sheltered us became our altar. Sometimes I imagined Tunde standing beside me, his umbrella tilted against the drizzle, that faint smile tugging at his mouth. Maybe mercy doesn't die. Maybe it just changes hands. In helping others, I could still feel his presence, not as a shadow, but as a promise kept. One afternoon, as the clouds gathered heavy and dark again, Angel tugged my arm. "Mama," she asked, "why do you still come here? We have a house now. You don't need to be here anymore." I looked down at her, at the same brown eyes that had once looked up at me under this very bridge, eyes that had seen too much and still managed to shine. I smiled through the drizzle. "Because the rain never forgets where mercy began," I said. And neither should we. Thunder rumbled above us, slow and distant, like a heartbeat echoing from heaven. I tilted my head back, letting the rain fall freely on my face, tasting the sky's memory. For a moment I closed my eyes and felt both men, my husband and Tunde, standing somewhere beyond the storm, watching over me, proud. As the thunder rolled again, a car slowed near the bridge, its headlights cutting through the curtain of rain. The door opened, and a man stepped out holding an umbrella. Black, familiar, and impossibly like Tunde's. My breath caught as he approached, the rain parting around him as though it knew his shape. And in that single heartbeat, I understood. Some stories don't end with goodbye. They end with the rain bringing you one last miracle. If this story touched your heart, don't let it fade with the rain. Share it so someone else remembers that mercy still exists in this world. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if fate tested you this way? Subscribe now, because every storm I share hides another truth waiting to be uncovered. Stay with me. The next story begins where this one left its final heartbeat.